Beneath the glittering facade of Victorian England, a horrifying truth lurked in the shadows. Imagine a world of grand homes and bustling elegance, yet within its very walls, terror stalked the innocent. Each night, as families slept soundly, small, terrified figures faced a silent, agonizing death in the suffocating darkness of narrow flues. They were England's forgotten children, condemned to a life of grime, pain, and an unimaginable end. This is the chilling story of the child chimney sweeps, whose brutal existence was a grim stain on an era of supposed progress. The necessity for these tiny victims arose directly from the very architecture of Victorian England itself. Grand houses, sprawling estates, and even humble city dwellings all featured intricate, often perilously narrow chimney flues. These twisted, constricted passages were simply impossible for adult sweeps to navigate, making them a grave and constant danger. Thus, a horrifying solution was born: the climbing boys. Children small enough to contort their bodies through the soot-choked labyrinths. They were seen not as human beings, but as mere living tools, their diminutive size a grim, exploitable asset. This brutal system was formalized through a cruel form of apprenticeship. Desperately impoverished families, often facing the specter of starvation, were tragically forced to sell their children into this brutal servitude, a transaction often thinly disguised as an educational opportunity. Orphans, having no one to protect them, were particularly vulnerable targets, frequently snatched from workhouses or the unforgiving streets and thrust into the hands of master sweeps. These were not willing apprentices, they were commodities, typically between the ages of 4 and 10, condemned to a life of unimaginable filth and danger. Their childhoods, if they ever had one, ended the moment they were handed over, stripped of their innocence and consigned to a hidden world of soot and silent screams. A child chimney sweep's day began long before dawn, a brutal routine rigidly set by the relentless demands of their cruel trade. Roused from a brief, restless sleep, they were often forced to wash themselves with cold, biting water from a bucket, a futile attempt to remove the layers of ingrained soot that clung stubbornly to their skin, hair, and lungs. Their meager breakfast, if they were lucky enough to receive any, was swallowed quickly, a meager fuel for the terrifying, dangerous work ahead. Then the grim ascent would begin. Armed with only a small brush and a scraper, their frail, small bodies were brutally forced into the dark, suffocating mouth of a chimney, their breaths already catching in the dust. The dangers inside the chimneys were immediate and constant, a relentless assault on their young, fragile lives. The flues themselves were often still hot from recent fires, causing agonizing, searing burns to their bare skin and tiny feet, forcing desperate, muffled cries that would go utterly unheard. The air within was thick, utterly suffocating with layers of fine soot and choking dust, which mercilessly choked their tiny lungs with every gasping breath, turning their innocent faces permanently black. Falls were a terrifying, ever-present threat as they scrambled precariously up narrow, vertical shafts, often hundreds of feet high, with little more than raw friction to secure their desperate ascent. But perhaps the most pervasive and soul-crushing horror was the terror of getting hopelessly stuck. A sudden, unexpected bend, a forgotten obstruction, or a moment of overwhelming exhaustion could trap a child for agonizing hours, sometimes even days in the suffocating, pitch-black darkness. Rescues, when they eventually came, often involved the brutal process of dismantling the chimney brick by brick, a desperate measure that could injure or even kill the trapped child. For these climbing boys, every single day was a descent into a sooty, inescapable hell. Each climb a horrifying gamble with slow, agonizing death in the suffocating silence. Beyond the immediate terrors of the chimney itself, the profession inflicted long-term, devastating health consequences that slowly, inexorably annihilated their young bodies. The pervasive soot, a toxic, corrosive combination of coal dust and tar, was a constant, insidious poison. It seeped into every pore, every crevice of their skin, leading to chronic infected sores that never truly healed, particularly on their knees and elbows, which were constantly scraped raw from climbing. Their developing bodies, routinely twisted and contorted through impossibly narrow flues, often suffered from severely twisted spines and stunted growth, leaving them permanently deformed, bent, and crooked for the remainder of their brief lives. But the most insidious and terrifying long-term horror was a specific, agonizing disease: chimney sweeps cancer. This was a particularly aggressive and disfiguring form of scrotal cancer, often appearing in adolescence, directly caused by the relentless, constant exposure to the carcinogenic soot. It was a painful, disfiguring illness that usually ended in a slow, agonizing death, a gruesome, inescapable legacy of their childhood labor. Beyond cancer, their lungs, constantly inhaling thick black dust and fumes, were ravaged by debilitating respiratory illnesses, chronic hacking coughs, severe asthma, and debilitating bronchitis that would tragically lead to early, suffocating deaths. These children lived lives of perpetual physical agony, their young bodies, meant for growth and joyous play, instead becoming instruments of self-inflicted torture and slow annihilation, forever marked by the grim soot and the silent screams echoing from the chimneys. Beyond the inherent dangers of the flues and the slow physical annihilation of their bodies, these children faced another, far more immediate horror: the absolute unchecked power and chilling cruelty of their masters. These so-called master sweeps, who either bought or took in the climbing boys, often proved to be relentless, brutal tormentors. Beatings were commonplace, a daily, horrifying ritual inflicted with brushes, sticks, or their bare hands, specifically designed to enforce absolute obedience and to overcome a child's natural, overwhelming fear of the dark, suffocating chimneys. When a child hesitated, cried out in terror, or simply tried to refuse climbing a particularly hot flue, some masters would resort to unimaginably brutal tactics, lighting small, scorching fires beneath them to literally force them upwards through the smoke and searing heat. This terrifying punishment often resulted in severe, disfiguring burns or even instantaneous death by suffocation, a horrifying measure of their ruthlessness. These weren't isolated incidents of cruelty. They were systemic abuses, deeply rooted in the complete dehumanization of these vulnerable children. The climbing boys were never truly viewed as apprentices, nor even as human beings deserving of basic care or compassion. Instead, they were treated as utterly expendable tools, interchangeable parts in a grim, unforgiving industry that devoured innocence. Their small bodies were merely instruments for a dirty, dangerous job, their childhood stripped away brutally, replaced by endless toil, unimaginable filth, and constant pain. They possessed no rights, no protection from the law, and no voice to cry out against their suffering. Their innocence was systematically destroyed, their inherent dignity obliterated, reducing them to little more than slaves, existing only to climb, scrape, and suffer in the suffocating darkness, entirely at the mercy of their masters' brutal whims. Despite the pervasive suffering and a chilling public indifference that allowed this horror to flourish, whispers of reform slowly, tentatively began to emerge from the darkness, fueled by a few courageous voices unwilling to ignore the unspeakable horrors any longer. As early as the 1760s, Jonas Hanway, a wealthy London merchant and passionate philanthropist, launched one of the first persistent and compassionate campaigns to improve the abysmal working conditions for sweeps apprentices. He tirelessly advocated for desperately needed legislation, driven by a genuine moral outrage and deep compassion for the children. However, these early, noble attempts at social reform faced immense and deeply entrenched resistance. Master sweeps vehemently opposed any change, clinging to their brutal practices and arguing, with perverse logic, that only children small enough could safely navigate the intricate, narrow flues of London's vast buildings. They cynically claimed that mechanical brushes, though invented by figures like George Smart in 1803, were ineffective and would inevitably lead to dangerous chimney fires, putting property at risk. Powerful industrialists and affluent homeowners, who benefited immensely from the cheap, brutal labor of these children, often sided with the masters, shamelessly preferring convenience and cost efficiency over basic human dignity. Parliament, swayed by powerful economic arguments and a pervasive lack of any real enforcement mechanisms, passed a series of ineffective acts over the decades. The Chimney Sweepers Act of 1788 was the first, setting a minimum apprenticeship age of 8, but it was largely and openly ignored. Subsequent acts in 1834, raising the age to 10, and 1840, raising it to 16 for actual climbing, also tragically failed, due to an almost complete absence of any means of real enforcement. Children as young as 4 continued, horrifyingly, to be forced up chimneys, their cries for help unheard by the law. The true, unwavering champion of these tormented children finally emerged in the form of Lord Shaftesbury, a dedicated and relentless social reformer whose moral compass was unshakable. From the 1840s onwards, Shaftesbury became the leading, most passionate voice for the climbing boys, relentlessly campaigning against what he termed satanic practices that disgraced England. He presented harrowing, undeniable evidence of widespread abuse, outright child stealing, and horrific, needless deaths directly to Parliament, pushing tirelessly for stricter, enforceable legislation. The publication of Charles Kingsley's poignant novel, The Water Babies, in 1863, with its central sympathetic character Tom, a child chimney sweep, did much to finally raise widespread public awareness and outrage, stirring the conscience of a nation. Yet even with mounting public pressure and new acts like the Chimney Sweepers Regulation Act of 1864, effective enforcement remained elusive, a frustrating roadblock to true change. The masters stubbornly continued their cruel trade, often moving from city to city to avoid scrutiny, treating the law as a mere inconvenience. It took decades of relentless advocacy, countless more tragic deaths, and the sheer unyielding tenacity of reformers like Lord Shaftesbury before the dark, indelible stain on Victorian England truly began to fade. Despite the growing whispers of reform for far too many child chimney sweeps, the inevitable end was a horrific and often unmourned death, a grim, inescapable consequence of their brutal existence. The very chimneys they were forced to clean, their daily workplace, tragically became their suffocating graves. Suffocation was a common and agonizing fate. A child climbing a perilously narrow soot-choked flue could become overwhelmed by the thick, choking dust, inhale toxic fumes from a smoldering fire still present within the bricks, or simply get hopelessly trapped in a constricted passage, unable to move up or down, their tiny bodies wedged immovably. Their muffled cries for help, desperate and terrifying, would go utterly unheard, slowly fading into a horrifying silence as they gasped their very last breaths. Literally entombed alive in the dark, unforgiving confines of the chimneys they were forced to clean. Fatal falls were another terrifying and ever-present reality, a constant dread lurking with every climb. A moment's slip on a treacherous, soot-covered brick, a sudden loss of grip in the claustrophobic darkness of the flue, could send a child tumbling hundreds of feet to their demise, their small, fragile bodies broken on the cold hearth below. Severe, disfiguring burns were also a constant threat, not just from the residual, searing heat of recently used flues, but from cruel masters deliberately lighting fires beneath them to force them upwards through the smoke and flames. These burns, often deep, agonizing, and festering, could lead to severe infections and a slow, excruciatingly painful death, compounded by the utter lack of proper medical care or antiseptic knowledge in that era. Even if they somehow survived the immediate daily dangers of the flues, the long-term, insidious consequences of their profession eventually caught up with them. The debilitating respiratory illnesses, the twisted spines, the chronic weeping sores, and most horrifyingly, the dreaded chimney sweeps cancer, a particularly aggressive and disfiguring form of scrotal cancer, slowly, inexorably led to agonizing and premature deaths in early adulthood, a gruesome, inescapable legacy of their childhood labor. The tragic irony was that these horrifying deaths, these profound human losses, often went utterly unnoticed by the wider public, swallowed by the grim realities of the era. There was a profound and systemic lack of dignity in their passing, just as there had been in their lives. Many children who tragically died within the flues were simply cut out by their masters and then secretly, unceremoniously buried in unmarked graves, the masters eager to avoid legal trouble or the financial loss of their property. Their deaths went officially unrecorded, their short, brutal lives unmourned by anyone beyond perhaps a forgotten sibling or a desperate, powerless parent. No elaborate funerals, no marked graves, just a silent, forgotten end. They were utterly consumed by the very brutal system that created them. They're passing a hidden, shameful statistic in the grand, glittering tapestry of Victorian England. Their final, unheard screams echoing only within the dark, unforgiving confines of the chimneys themselves. The horrifying reality of child chimney sweeping, so long hidden in the suffocating darkness of Victorian England's flues, could not, and ultimately did not, endure forever. Decades of relentless advocacy by tireless reformers like Lord Shaftesbury, coupled with the accumulating, undeniable evidence of unimaginable suffering and needless, agonizing deaths, finally forced a profound, irreversible change. After years of entrenched resistance from those who ruthlessly profited from the cheap, brutal labor, the Chimney Sweepers Act of 1875 was at last passed, effectively and unequivocally abolishing the use of climbing boys across the nation. This was not merely a legislative victory, it was a profound triumph for the burgeoning concepts of child rights and social justice, a hard-won battle against entrenched cruelty and chilling economic indifference. The immense suffering of these forgotten children, their agonizing lives and unmourned deaths, became a powerful, undeniable catalyst for broader social reforms across many industries, wrenching open the eyes of a nation to the grim realities hidden beneath its celebrated progress. Their unwilling sacrifice laid a crucial foundation for the protection of all vulnerable children across many other exploitative industries, marking a true, if belated, dawn of understanding and compassion in Britain. The legacy of child chimney sweeps remains a permanent, indelible stain on the otherwise celebrated tapestry of Victorian grandeur. A stark and chilling reminder that even in eras of supposed enlightenment and progress, profound cruelty can fester in plain sight when basic human dignity is callously overlooked. Their story forces us to confront uncomfortable, timeless truths about exploitation, the often horrifying price of industrial advancement, and the chilling capacity for systemic indifference within any society. It is a timeless lesson that the most vulnerable among us often bear the heaviest, most agonizing burdens, and that the fundamental fight for basic human dignity is a constant, ongoing, and often brutal struggle that demands eternal vigilance. It compels us to remember that true societal progress is measured not just by technological innovation, economic might, or grand empires, but by the compassion and protection shown to the weakest, most helpless members of society. If this chilling, in-depth tale of child chimney sweeps and their brutal, unmourned lives left you unsettled and eager for more hidden histories and profound human stories, please do hit that like button. Share this video with someone who appreciates the darker, more profound truths of the past. And don't forget to subscribe to Tales of Tortures and turn on notifications so you never miss another journey into history's most compelling, terrifying, and illuminating stories. Stay tuned.